In this module, we're focusing on a very small level, microscopic, the junction between two neurons, really, so the gap between two neurons. And so you have neuron 1 is communicating with neuron 2, and it's that communication that we're going to talk about. And we'll go through each of the steps involved in this synaptic transmission. If you take the example of being burned by a hot pot, let's see how that information is communicated within the nervous system. So we have sensory and motor neurons in our somatic nervous system, which are part of the peripheral nervous system, also known as PNS, and then interneurons in the central nervous system. So looking at this image here on the right, you have a sensory neuron. There's an afferent projection to the spinal cord. There's a synapse on an interneuron, and then another synapse on a motor neuron to the effector neuron, or to the muscle, also part of the somatic nervous system. So let's talk a little bit about what that communication is that's happening within the spinal cord. So the sensory neuron is talking to the interneuron, and the interneuron is talking to that motor neuron. So with the action potential coming down this one axon, so we're using the example of our sensory neuron, that information makes it to the end of the neuron known as the terminal. So the action potential comes into the terminal, and the vesicles, there are vesicles in the terminal that contain packets of neurotransmitters. And these vesicles then move and fuse with the membrane of the terminal and spill the neurotransmitter into that synapse, into that gap. So now the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse and it binds to the receptor. Okay, so the chemicals from that presynaptic neuron are going to bind to protein receptors located on the postsynaptic cell. When that happens, something happens in that postsynaptic cell. There's going to be a change in polarity. The next cell may become more positive on the inside, more negative on the inside. There's going to be a change that happens in that next cell based on the flow of ions. And once the neurotransmitter then has its effect, it needs to be removed from the synapse. Typically one of the mechanisms is it's brought back into that presynaptic cell, or it could be degraded by enzymes located there, or it could diffuse passively away. So again, we've got our sensory and motor neurons. They're part of the peripheral nervous system, and they're talking to the sensory neuron is talking to an interneuron in the central nervous system, in this case in the spinal cord. Let's use as an example the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is used in multiple places in the nervous system, but in particular on the effector muscle that you see there. So at the neuromuscular junction, the junction between the neuron and the muscle, there is the release of this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine that causes then activation of the muscle. We've talked about, so we've identified that there's a peripheral nervous system. In this example, we've talked about the somatic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system. There's also the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and spinal cord. We saw information coming into the spinal cord for that reflex arc. We also need to know that the information is transmitted not only in that arc, but also up to the brain. And there are different parts of the brain. There's the cortex, where communication is happening between neurons. There's a lot of synapses happening there. And then other parts of the brain as well, like the thalamus, the cerebellum, the hippocampus. And these structures and these different parts of the brain all rely on different neurotransmitters to allow for communication amongst the cells. Some examples of additional neurotransmitters, and actually more than 100 have been identified, but there are different types of neurotransmitters. There are amino acids, monoamines, peptides, and others like acetylcholine that we discussed, and anandamide. And these all have different effects on the postsynaptic cell, but primarily they are allowing for communication from the first neuron to the second neuron. So the information goes from electrical, which is the action potential, to chemical, the neurotransmitter, and then back to an electrical signal in the next cell. So this has been the tutorial on synapses, You're now ready to take the quiz on this section, and then please review any of the additional materials that are available to you.